When you close your eyes and imagine a utopia, what do you see? Rolling fields of green, waves crashing upon a shore, a vibrant community thriving in peace. Or do you think of oil spills and billowing smoke? A society that can't seem to stop prioritizing power over life. That's what we thought. The year is 2080, and this is Yarmouth.
This battle line's being drawn. Nobody right if everybody's wrong. Young people speaking their minds. There's so much resistance from behind. I think we stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
Yarmouth, a pastoral paradise where the natural world is the top priority, where people only take what they need, where the economy is dependent on the trade of only sustainable resources, and where people rely on their neighbors and local communities to survive and thrive. But it wasn't easy to get it here. In the early 21st century, the climate was crying out for help. The melted ice caps were flooding the Florida coastline. The summers were so hot, flip-flops melted to cement. Big corporations were diverting the public's attention from the crisis. Whole sections of the country were burning for half the year. Yet lawmakers avoided the crisis. Something had to be done. These four experts helped educate the younger generation on how to move on from this self-destructive path.
My name is Terry Chapin.
My name is Carol Browner.
My name is Christine Beeling,
My name is Chimi Dorji.
and I work for the Environmental Protection Agency. So it's the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And I am the team leader for something called Sustainable Materials Management.
I worked at the University of Alaska as an ecologist and as a climate change scientist.
I work as a consultant on environmental issues in Bhutan, and we work a lot around water and water-related issues, but also on general environment and climate issues.
I ran the Environmental Protection Agency for 8 years. I also worked for President Obama in the White House. I was the climate czar. I was responsible for developing his climate agenda, both domestic and global. Today, I work with companies who are looking to reduce their impact on the planet. And I work in the environmental community where I chair the board of directors of a nonprofit committed to electing officials who want to stop the climate problem.
To begin the journey of fighting climate change and building our utopia, it was important that we stepped back and realized to transform our world, we must rely on one another. The first step we took was to form localized communities who relied on each other.
Like taking a step back a little bit, if we look at Bhutan, it's maybe the size of a small county in the US. Until the 1970s, we have predominantly not even opened up to the outside world. But in the last 5-6 decades now, we have been developing when it comes to the socio-economic context, the GDP growth rate, or in terms of Western education and even the literacy rate have been increasing quite a lot. So when we started looking at options to prepare ourselves for this world that has gone already 100 years of development, there was definitely a big attraction, like that world looks more interesting. Maybe we should go that route. And maybe we should also start exploiting our natural resources. But then fortunately, in our case, our forefathers and our decision makers and leaders, especially led by His Majesty the King, had this far-sighted leadership. When we saw the outside world that has gone with 100 years of development and so much of difference compared to our world, then okay, no, maybe perhaps we should not go that route. And it's for that matter, for instance, we have this development philosophy called the gross national happiness. We do activities in this field, and also looking at our traditional practices. We also try to look at indigenous ways of conserving the environment, of making homes more energy efficient, planning and building villages or homes that are more environmentally friendly.
The localized community we formed in our utopia was heavily modeled after Native American communities and reservations.
In some ways, these isolated communities are some of the most important communities in the world in shaping the future of our planet. It turns out that indigenous people occupy about 25% of the land surface. These are the places where ecosystems are the least disturbed, where there's the greatest biodiversity, where there's the greatest opportunities to keep and sustain a future for nature on the planet. And these communities are the stewards of those lands because since they are isolated, they depend on relationship to those lands.
Our utopia relies on locally grown food to lower the rate of carbon emissions due to exports. Renewable energy, including solar, hydro, and wind power. And instead of turning to big companies and corporations for goods, we turn to each other for locally made items and services. Mutual aid has become normalized to help all members of the community work on their ambitions and lead a safe life. And most importantly, the community makes all of their large decisions as a community to make sure all voices are heard. We had to set a precedent right off the bat that we would maximize Yarmouth's budget to fund the most environmentally sustainable options for all of our resources. If the publicly owned vehicles need to be replaced, for example, we replace them with electric ones.
So when they're doing their budget and how they're going to spend their money, they buy cars for the policemen. You know, you could have electric cars as opposed to fossil fuel. At every turn, there are decisions that can be made. Now, some of them come with a immediate cost, right? In other words, that electric vehicle is going to cost you $5,000 more. But for a city who's looking at sort of the long-term health of their residents, the cost of allowing the climate to worsen, the fact that more bad storms will come, that has a cost too.
And yes, up front, the decision to do this can seem a little pricey. But the thing is, once enough towns make the decision to run their vehicles with electricity and depend on sustainable resources, a market is created for them. And this is where the second major component of Yarmouth's utopia comes in. The term tipping points refers to the idea that once enough people, businesses, communities, and governments make the decision to rely on sustainable resources, it becomes profitable to create and provide those resources. It's more profitable, for one, because sustainable resources like solar, hydro, and wind don't cause long-term effects that need to be mitigated. It is also profitable because a whole economy making the decision to rely on sustainable resources creates a market for them.
A good example is Microsoft has to build server farms, right? They have to run all these big computers, and they're something called a server farm. Server farms have to be cooled to a certain temperature. They use a lot of energy. When you build a server farm, you use a lot of cement. Making cement is very energy intensive. It just takes up a lot of fossil fuel. There is now a type of cement that literally absorbs carbon, but it hasn't yet become widely used because it's more expensive. The technology isn't everywhere. But if someone like Microsoft comes along and says, every time we buy cement, and we buy a lot of it, we're only going to buy this kind of cement, the better cement, the greener cement, then the industry will start to make more and more of it. And you reach a tipping point where literally the only thing being made is the greener cement. Now, we're not there yet. This is a very new undertaking, but we've seen this in other industries where somebody makes a better widget, a better solution. And at first, one company uses it and then two, but eventually everyone starts using it and it becomes the only solution, and all the bad solutions have gone away.
We've subdivided into about 4 or 5 different neighborhoods around Fairbanks. And each of these neighborhoods organized homeowners that were interested in putting solar panels on their homes. And so we got together as a group and put out a request for proposals for local solar panel installers and said, well, if you give us a price break on solar panels and tell us more about what we can do to improve our energy efficiency, then we'll help you find customers where you can install solar panels. So that was a huge advantage for the solar installer that wanted to do that work. And in return, he gave each of us a price break on the cost of solar panels.
And so, for example, I live in Washington, D.C. As an individual, I have a choice with my utility. I can say I want clean energy to be my electricity. It doesn't mean I get that electron, but it means they have to buy that much more. So I'm using my power as a consumer to generate demand for more solar panels at utility, not on homes, but the big solar farms you're starting to see. When we first started when people like me first started advocating to use more wind and solar, it was expensive. And so if you were going to buy electricity, like I'm a company, I need to buy electricity, maybe I didn't want to buy the more expensive stuff, right? I'd buy the coal, I'd buy the natural gas. It was cheaper. So I looked at how much it was going to cost me a kilowatt hour, and I'd make a choice. Today, wind and solar is almost at what we call parity. In other words, it is the same price point. And so we all make choices every day that can make a difference.
Once we reached these tipping points in the market, it became not only possible but profitable for us to rely on sustainable resources. The third thing we made the conscious decision to do was to prioritize environmental sustainability over short-term economic development. This meant that we recognized that if we could live within the natural world and benefit off its resources without exploiting it, we could grow a more healthy and viable economy whilst maintaining a vibrant natural environment. Chimi Dorji talks about how this works in Bhutan.
We have looked at finding the fine balance between, yes, we need to develop, we need to have schools, we need to have hospitals, we need to have better road connectivity, we need to have cleaner sources of energy and cleaner homes and better water supply systems and sanitation facilities. But then again, not at the cost of the environment, not at the cost of cutting down the trees in our forest or mining our mountains, but looking at it from a more sustainable, holistic perspective. Other example that I can think of is just the last week, we are for the first time ever trying to look at environmental flows in our rivers because of the hydropower projects. I talked about how good hydropower is in Bhutan's context, the hydropower projects, because in a lot of cases they are run off the river, smaller hydropower projects, but then there are fishes in the rivers like anywhere else. Our colleagues from the hydropower sector are saying, no, we have to let that water into the turbine because we get the maximum energy generation, and this is the backbone of our economy. But on the other hand, there are a bunch of our fish and aquatic biodiversity guys saying that, no, we can't do that. Look at what Switzerland is doing, what Austria is doing, what is happening in the Columbia River, for instance, where they are talking about taking down dams because they have realized the importance of biodiversity now. So it's trying to find the fine balance between the environment and the economy.
The fourth component of our climate utopia was establishing a mindset in the general public where we prioritize need over want. Life, we realized, will not be better if we simply have more things. Not only does this mean that we consume less resources and thus less resources are wasted, but being dependent on less items means that it is easier to rely on one's neighbors and community to provide the necessary resources for living.
Climate conscious utopia for me would be where we are conscious of what we are doing and what we are using. Going back to, like in my case, not that far, in the 80s, where we are using the bare minimum resources that we actually require. And people were surviving. They were okay with those things then, and we should be now.
That kind of gets back to the whole conversation of reduce, reuse, recycle, trying to use reusables. A whole bunch of college campuses are really going to reusables, where you have little reusable salad bowls with a little cover. And you chip in, you buy one at the beginning, you kind of get them washed and you bring them back. So there's a whole conversation about reusables and the value of that.
We have all these fancy things around us. We may have extra jeans or additional electronic equipment or a camera, which I believe are absolutely not necessary.
So much of it is so simple, like the cups. We did a waste audit at EPA and trying to get folks to pay attention to what they have. And I can't tell you how many coffee cups, right? So if you could get people just to bring their own cup, water bottles, just try to make some simple changes.
My wife thinks that I am a miser, someone who really is stingy. But in my context, I think that everyone tries to do that. So that would be my climate utopia. Then all of our problems, especially in terms of climate, would just go away.
Despite these efforts, there is of course still some waste. But this is where the fifth and final component comes in: sustainable waste management. There are many forms of waste that humans can produce, but the main thing we focused on during our Utopia's foundation was plastic and food waste. To get rid of our reliance on single-use products, we worked on community rules and regulations surrounding the use of single-use products. Bamboo utensils and glass straws became the new normal. Packaging moved from plastic to paper. This kind of packaging can be more expensive though, and we knew that they had to be accessible to everyone. We set up government regulations that required restaurants and stores to provide these sustainable materials. We changed our norms. The market in the community changed too. Prices for eco-conscious options lowered because they became the only option. In short, once again, our community hit a tipping point where the market adjusted to the new way of life.
And that's why it's important to have government regulation, because what government regulation is, it steps in and says, okay, everybody's going to do the good behavior. And then you drive down the price. So it's not a choice that I make as an individual. It's a fact that when I buy this or that, the government has said it has to be made by clean energy. It has to have a lower carbon footprint. And so that's another tool. There's the consumer choices, there's the industry choices, but there's also the role of the government. And we've made a lot of history in the United States in terms of air pollution, water pollution, toxic pollution, because the government stepped in and said, no, that's bad behavior, you can't do it. And then everyone had to comply. So there was no longer the issue of a consumer choice. Everyone was getting the benefit of that cleaner commitment.
Beyond single-use plastic, food waste was still a prevalent issue in our blooming community. The need versus want strategy helped our community to cut down on the amount of food we were buying, meaning the amount of food wasted was cut down too. But food waste was still a problem, so we developed an accessible food waste management system.
I want to share with you is something called our food recovery hierarchy, which is this really cool triangle. It's an inverted triangle. At the top of the triangle is source reduction. You don't make food waste in the first place. You pay attention, right? You just don't waste it. The second is if you do have waste, and it's not waste, but excess food or food that has the second value, you use donation capabilities. Feed the people, feed the animals, make some energy. Out in Western Mass, we have anaerobic digesters that take food waste and make energy out of wasted food. Composting, we all need to keep our soils intact. And at the very bottom of our triangle is landfill. Like I said, no food waste to landfill or incineration. So just really paying attention to what we do with our food and how we manage it.
Composting became accessible because the town made it a priority. Paid for by the town, trucks would come by once a week to pick up compost just like they do with trash and recyclables. The compost was then brought to different community garden sites where it went back into feeding our lovely Yarmouth. In this way, sustainable food waste management became something everyone could participate in. It took 60 years to create this utopia, and it wasn't easy either. It took personal sacrifice and the ability to heed the warnings and advice of those who had the knowledge to make this place possible. It took stepping into the future and leaving our old world behind. By creating localized communities, maximizing their budgets to provide sustainable options, switching our dependencies, and creating a market for sustainable resources. Prioritizing what we need over what we want, and managing what waste we do have in a sustainable way, we created a climate-conscious community. This is the future. This is our utopia. This is Yarmouth.
Ooh, we have everything we need. Ooh, we have everything we need. Ooh, 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 we have everything we need. Oh, we began after the storm inside. Yeah, lay the land. It's just a morning light. Switch my attitude. I'm so radical. All these people mad at do this for who it mattered to. What if Eve made apple juice? You gonna do what Adam do? Or say, baby, let's put this back on the tree. 'Cause we have everything we need. Yeah. We have everything we need. Ooh, we have everything we need. Oh, we have everything we need. Yeah. It's just the morning light, yeah. We have everything we need. We have everything we need. We have everything we need. We have everything we need.
Skinty Penguin Productions.